It was supposed to stay buried, forever, locked away in the darkness of palace archives where nobody asks questions and nobody dares to look. But secrets, no matter how deeply they're hidden, have a way of finding their own way to the surface. And when they do, they don't just create ripples, they create tsunamis. Subscribe right now because what you're about to hear will fundamentally reshape your understanding of the British monarchy and expose vulnerabilities that the institution has spent centuries trying to conceal. The story begins not with drama or scandal. It begins with routine. A cataloging project deep within the bowels of Buckingham Palace. A junior archivist working through boxes of forgotten documents. Someone doing the kind of invisible work that keeps institutions functioning. Nobody expected to find anything extraordinary. Nobody anticipated that the dusty contents of an old envelope would eventually shake the crown to its very foundation. The archivist's name was Simon. He had worked in the palace archives for 3 years without incident. His job was methodical and unremarkable. Sort documents, record information, file everything according to protocol. It was the kind of work that required attention to detail, but not imagination. It was the kind of work that most people would find tedious beyond description. But Simon found comfort in it. There was something satisfying about bringing order to chaos, about preserving history, even if nobody would ever see what he was preserving. On a Tuesday evening, working late as he often did, Simon was processing a collection of items that had been recently transferred from storage. Most of it was routine, official correspondence, administrative documents, the kind of material that fills the archives of any institution. But then his gloved hand encountered something different. An envelope. Old. Unstamped. The paper was delicate, almost translucent with age, and on the front, written in elegant script, were 4 words that made his heart stop. For you alone. Always. Simon's hands trembled as he carefully opened the envelope. Inside were pages, multiple pages, written in the same elegant handwriting. As he began to read, his understanding of what he was holding shifted fundamentally. These weren't administrative documents. These weren't official records. These were love letters, intimate confessions written in moments of vulnerability, declarations of longing and desire that were never meant for public consumption. The handwriting was distinctive. Simon had seen it before in other palace documents, official letters, signatures on decrees. But here, in these private pages, that same hand had written things that contradicted everything the public believed about the life of the person who had written them. The letters spoke of yearning for someone specific, of nights spent thinking about this person, of a love that couldn't be openly acknowledged, of a secret that had to be kept hidden from the world. Simon's first instinct was to report his discovery. That was protocol. That was his job. But something made him hesitate. Something about the intimate nature of what he was holding suggested that this wasn't meant to be processed through official channels. This was something personal, something that had been deliberately hidden, something that perhaps was meant to stay hidden. He carefully resealed the envelope and placed it back where he had found it, but not before making a mental note of its location. Not before understanding that what he had discovered was significant in ways he couldn't fully articulate. He finished his shift and left the archives, his mind churning with questions about what he should do, what he could do, whether his obligation was to the institution or to the privacy of the person who had written these words decades ago. That night, he didn't sleep well. He kept thinking about the letters, about the handwriting, about the identity of the person to whom they had been written. He kept wondering whether he had the right to know what he now knew, whether anyone had the right to know, whether some secrets were meant to remain secrets forever. The next morning, Simon arrived at the archives to find everything changed. The area where he had been working had been secured. Access was restricted. A senior official was there, his expression grave and unreadable. The official explained that there had been a security review. Certain materials had been flagged for additional evaluation. Simon was reassigned to a different section of the archives, working on different projects. No explanation was given, no justification was offered, but Simon understood immediately. Someone had noticed his hesitation. Someone had observed his discovery. Someone had decided that the letters needed to be secured before they could be properly processed and filed away into official records. The machinery of institutional control had moved swiftly and silently. The potentially dangerous material had been contained, or so the palace believed. Because what the palace didn't know was that the envelope had already been photographed, that images of every page had already been captured and transmitted to someone outside the institution, that the secret, which had been kept for decades, was now in the hands of people who understood its explosive potential, that the countdown to exposure had already begun. The person responsible for photographing the letters was someone on the palace staff, someone with access, someone trusted, someone who had decided that the truth was more important than loyalty to an institution that had asked them to keep secrets. They had moved quickly and carefully, documenting every page, every word, every signature. Then they had reached out to a journalist they knew, a journalist with a reputation for breaking stories that powerful institutions wanted buried, a journalist who understood the significance of what was being offered. The journalist received the images and immediately understood that this was the story of a lifetime, not because of the content itself, but because of what the content represented, a crack in the facade of a monarchy that had been carefully constructed to appear seamless and perfect. Evidence that even those who sat on thrones had hidden depths, secret lives, desires and longings that contradicted the official narrative of their existence. The decision was made to publish, but not immediately. The journalist wanted to verify the authenticity of the letters first, to confirm the handwriting, to establish beyond doubt that what had been discovered was genuine. They reached out to handwriting experts, they contacted historians, they spoke quietly to people who had known the person in question decades earlier. And with each verification, the story became more solid, more undeniable, more explosive. The publication date was set. The story would break on a Friday morning. It would catch the palace by surprise. There would be no opportunity for them to spin the narrative in advance, no time for them to craft responses or coordinate denial. The truth, in its raw and unmediated form, would simply appear, and the world would read it. And the world would be transformed by what it read. As the weekend approached, as the journalist made final preparations, the palace continued on as if nothing was wrong. The king performed his duties. The queen consort attended her engagements. The machinery of the monarchy ground on, unaware that it was about to be disrupted in ways that nobody could have anticipated. The letters themselves were remarkable for their poetry and their pain. They were written by someone who understood the constraints of their position, someone who knew that certain feelings could never be publicly acknowledged, someone who had to express their deepest emotions in secret. The language was formal in places, reflecting the education and station of the person who had written them. But beneath that formality was raw emotion, real longing, real desperation. One line appeared again and again throughout the letters. You are the truth I cannot speak, the love I cannot claim, the future I cannot have. It was repeated like a mantra, like a prayer, like the only way the writer could process the impossible situation in which they found themselves. The letters spoke of a time when the writer had been younger, less constrained by duty, more free to follow their heart. But even then, the relationship had been complicated, secretive, known only to the two people involved. As the publication date approached, the journalist who had obtained the letters reached out one more time to the palace. This was a courtesy, a chance for them to respond, a chance for them to provide context or explanation before the story broke. The palace, unaware of what was coming, initially dismissed the inquiry as baseless. They had no knowledge of any such letters. The journalist must be mistaken. This was surely misinformation designed to damage the institution, but when the journalist provided specifics, when they described details that could not have been invented, the palace's tone shifted. Emergency meetings were called. Senior officials were summoned. The gravity of the situation was understood immediately. The letters were real, they existed, and they were about to become public. The palace's response was chaos disguised as protocol. Files were pulled. Searches were conducted. The discovery was traced back to the archives and to Simon. He was questioned about his work, about what he had seen, about whether he had spoken to anyone about his findings. Simon, terrified and uncertain about what was happening, admitted to his discovery but denied having leaked the information to anyone. Whether he was believed or not remains unclear to this day. Preparations were made for the inevitable. Statements were drafted. Responses were prepared. The palace entered a state of controlled crisis management. But even as they prepared their defenses, they understood that there was no defense against this. The letters were real. The emotions they expressed were real. The secret life they revealed was real. And no amount of institutional power could make those realities disappear. The night before publication, the king was informed. The complete details of what was about to be released were laid before him. He listened in silence as officials explained what the letters contained, where they had been found, how they had been leaked, and what they would mean when the story broke. He asked only one question: "Are they authentic?" The answer was yes. He asked nothing else. He simply sat in his study, staring at nothing, as the weight of what was coming pressed down on him. The woman who had written those letters, the woman whose private emotions were about to be exposed to the entire world, was his wife. The woman he had spent his life defending. The woman he had chosen despite the objections of everyone around him. The woman whose past he believed he knew completely. But he had known nothing. Or rather, he had known one version of her, and there was another version entirely. A version that had existed decades ago. A version that had loved someone else. A version that had written passionate love letters to a man who was not him. That night he didn't sleep. He sat in his study, and he waited for the morning to come. And when it did, when the story broke, when the headlines screamed across every newspaper and every screen, he finally understood what it meant to be truly alone. Even in a palace full of people, even in a position of ultimate power, even surrounded by advisors and staff and family, he was completely, utterly alone with the knowledge that his marriage, which he had believed to be something sacred and untouchable, had depths and shadows that he had never fully comprehended. Friday morning arrived like a blade slicing through silence. The newspapers hit the streets before dawn. By the time most people woke up and reached for their coffee, the story was already spreading like a virus through every corner of the media landscape. The headline was simple and devastating. Hidden love letters expose royal secret. Below it were excerpts, phrases that were unmistakably intimate, declarations of longing written in elegant script. The handwriting was recognizable to anyone who had ever seen official palace documents. The public woke up to scandal, not the kind of scandal that could be managed through careful spin and strategic silence. This was the kind of scandal that couldn't be contained, that couldn't be explained away, that couldn't be dismissed as misunderstanding or exaggeration. It was documented. It was verified. It was real. Social media exploded almost immediately. Within minutes, the story was the only thing anyone was talking about. Hashtags trended worldwide. News outlets interrupted regular programming. Talk shows reorganized their entire schedules to cover the breaking story. The British monarchy, an institution that had survived centuries of wars and revolutions and scandals, was facing a crisis that nobody had anticipated. A crisis that struck at the very heart of what people believed about the crown. The letters themselves became the focus of intense analysis. Every word was dissected, every phrase was examined, experts debated the handwriting, historians researched the timeline. The public, armed with smartphones and internet access, became amateur detectives. They compared the letters to other known documents. They analyzed the language used. They constructed timelines trying to identify the mysterious recipient of these passionate declarations. The palace's initial response was denial. Spokespersons issued statements suggesting the letters might be fabrications. They questioned the authenticity of the documents. They suggested that enemies of the monarchy were spreading misinformation designed to damage the institution. But even as they made these denials, journalists were producing independent verification. Handwriting experts were confirming authenticity. Archives were being accessed. The evidence supporting the letters' legitimacy was overwhelming. Within hours, the palace's denial strategy had collapsed. A new statement was issued. The letters were acknowledged to be real, but they were described as belonging to a different era, a different time in the life of the person who had written them. The palace suggested that publishing these private, personal documents represented a gross invasion of privacy. They threatened legal action against the publication that had released the story. But threats meant nothing in the face of a public hungry for answers. The palace's attempts to contain the damage only seemed to amplify it. Every denial generated more questions. Every explanation raised new doubts. The institution that had always been able to control its image found itself completely unable to manage the narrative. The narrative was controlling them. By noon, the story had completely consumed the news cycle. Every major outlet in the world was reporting on the letters. Cable news networks had created special programming dedicated to analyzing every aspect of the scandal. British newspapers ran special editions. International press descended on London, setting up camp outside the palace, hoping for any statement or clarification that might help explain what was happening. The letters themselves, reproduced in their entirety across multiple publications, became something of a cultural touchstone. People read them, people debated them, people analyzed them for hidden meanings and deeper truths. And the language was formal in some places, intimate in others. The writer expressed longing and frustration and a kind of resigned acceptance that certain desires could never be fulfilled. One phrase appeared again and again in discussions and analyses: "I love you in the way that makes the world make sense." It was a line that seemed to capture the intensity of what the writer had been experiencing when they put pen to paper decades earlier. It was a line that suggested this wasn't just casual affection. This was love, deep love, the kind of love that changed how you understood your own existence. As the day progressed, the focus of the scandal began to shift. People began asking a different question, not just about the authenticity of the letters, but about who had received them. Who was the mysterious man to whom these passionate declarations had been directed? The palace maintained absolute silence on this question. They would not confirm or deny the identity of the recipient. They would not provide any information that might help solve the puzzle. But the silence only intensified the mystery. Online communities formed dedicated to identifying the man. Amateur historians dug through archives. Former palace staff were contacted and interviewed. Old photographs were examined with microscopic intensity. Every person in the background of every image from the relevant time period became a potential suspect. Theories circulated wildly. Some suggested the recipient was a prominent aristocrat. Others believed he was someone connected to the palace. Still others speculated that he was someone entirely outside the royal world. Each theory came with supporting evidence. Each theory had its advocates and its critics. The nation engaged in a collective puzzle-solving exercise, trying to uncover a truth that the palace was desperate to keep hidden. Meanwhile, inside the palace, the emotional aftermath was unfolding with devastating intensity. The king had spent the night reading the letters in their entirety. Copies had been provided to him by the palace communications team, as if understanding the text himself was somehow necessary for managing the crisis. He read them multiple times. Each reading seemed to wound him differently. By morning, he was devastated in a way that official duty could not conceal. His staff noted his withdrawn demeanor. His advisors observed his distraction. When he was informed that the publication had gone ahead despite palace objections, that the letters were now public knowledge, he simply nodded, as if he had expected nothing less. As if the entire world was now privy to his private heartbreak. The king did not attend his scheduled engagements that day. He did not make public appearances. He did not issue any statements. He simply disappeared into the private quarters of the palace, leaving his staff to field questions and manage the crisis as best they could. Messages began arriving from world leaders offering support. Calls came from heads of state expressing concern. The international community was watching, understanding that what was happening in London had implications far beyond Britain's borders. But inside the palace, in a private study filled with the morning light that seemed too bright for such darkness, the king was alone with his thoughts. Alone with the knowledge that his wife, the woman he had fought for, had once loved someone else with an intensity that now seemed to contradict everything he believed about their relationship. He held the letters in his hands. The paper was fragile. The ink was faded. But the words were clear. They were unmistakable. They were devastating. He read them as a king might read state documents with attention and seriousness, but he also read them as a man, as a husband who was trying to understand how the woman he loved could have harbored such feelings for another person. The queen consort, meanwhile, was in her own rooms. She had not been informed in advance that the letters would be published. She had woken up like everyone else and learned about the scandal through the media. The initial shock gave way to horror as she realized what was now public knowledge. Her private words, her secret emotions, her hidden past, all of it was now available for the entire world to read and judge and analyze. She made no public statement. She issued no denial. She simply retreated into silence just as the palace had advised. But that silence was agony, because it meant she had no opportunity to explain, no chance to provide context, no ability to shape how her words were being interpreted. She could only wait and watch as the world reached its own conclusions about who she was and what she had been. By afternoon, the first calls for her removal had begun. Opinion pieces appeared in major publications questioning whether someone who had harbored such secret affections could be trusted to represent the monarchy. Some commentators suggested she should step down. Others argued that the entire institution should reconsider her position as queen consort. The public, divided as always, split into opposing camps. Some defended her right to privacy and her freedom from judgment for her past. Others condemned what they saw as deception and betrayal. The media frenzy intensified as evening fell. Television networks brought in royal experts to analyze what the letters meant for the future of the monarchy. Psychologists were consulted to discuss the implications of the secret affection. Historians provided context about the era in which the letters had been written. The entire apparatus of contemporary media was mobilized to process and explain and speculate about what had been revealed, and through it all the palace maintained its silence. No new statements, no clarifications, no explanations, just silence, which paradoxically seemed to confirm everyone's worst suspicions. The absence of response was interpreted as guilt. The refusal to explain was read as admission. The silence that was meant to protect the institution instead seemed to indict it. By evening, protest groups had begun gathering outside the palace. Nothing violent, nothing threatening, but visible. People with signs, people with demands, people who believed that the monarchy needed to account for what had been revealed. The institution that had always existed above public judgment was suddenly being subjected to it, and it was unclear whether it could survive the scrutiny. Inside the palace, emergency meetings continued into the night. The crisis team worked on response strategies. Communications advisors debated how to address the scandal. Constitutional experts discussed the implications. Legal teams prepared for potential lawsuits and formal complaints. The machinery of institutional survival ground on, even as the institution itself seemed to be crumbling from within. But in the private quarters, in the study where the king sat alone with the letters, none of that mattered. None of the institutional crisis management could touch the personal devastation unfolding in silence. The man was broken. And no statement, no strategy, no amount of official response could fix what had been broken. As night fell on London, the city itself seemed changed. The scandal hung over it like a cloud. People gathered in pubs and homes, debating what it meant, what it would mean for the future, whether the monarchy could survive, whether anything would ever be the same. The answer, everyone sensed, was no. Whatever happened next, whatever was revealed, whatever came in the days and weeks ahead, the innocence was gone. The illusion of a perfect institution had been shattered, and the pieces, once broken, could never be reassembled in quite the same way.